Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, this week we have organized series of lecture on research method and methodology. In the last introductory lecture, we discussed how to select a research problem, making hypothesis, and also briefly discussed about the different method like qualitative and quantitative method. We will move further and will try to dissect the different approaches of qualitative and quantitative method, and we precisely focus today on qualitative method, content analysis, and tomorrow lecture will discuss interpretative method of content. So there are several other lectures on this very topic on research method. We will follow other lectures. And for discussion on this very topic, today we have in the studio Dr. Satish Jha. He teaches political science in Delhi University and has a number of publications in national and international journal, and his area of interest in Indian politics, comparative politics, and research method. So on his behalf, I welcome him for EduSet lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Amrinduji. In fact, today's discussion is on the qualitative research technique known as content analysis. In next two lectures spread over 2 days, in fact, we will be focusing mostly on this qualitative research in social science. Now, as you know, these days research is becoming one area where a number of techniques and methods are utilized, and these techniques and methods are primarily meant to make the entire enterprise more objective, more communicable, more useful for the larger purpose of the discipline as well as for the society. Now, keeping in mind that requirement, this research methodology, the area of research methodology has been expanding over the years, and it has devised many techniques. The techniques which are earlier were being used in scientific research, but now they are being put into operation even in social science research to a great extent. Now, when we talk of methodology, research methodology, normally we mean by research methodology two different types of methods. One is the method what is known as quantitative research method, and other is qualitative research method. Now, this quantitative research method primarily stands for a methodology in which mostly the data which is used for investigation is quantified, and for quantifying those data the tools which are invariably used are mathematical, statistical, and so on and so forth, and the purpose is just to quantify and make it as communicable, as objective as any other mathematical formulation or a statistical representation could imply. So, I mean, this is perhaps one of the aspect of quantitative research methodology. So far as the qualitative research method is concerned, it is much more complicated, complex and sophisticated, in the sense that it deals with the qualitative aspect of the research theme. Now, when we talk of qualitative aspect, what we imply by qualitative aspect, that we are not simply dealing with objective facts, but we are also dealing with subjective concerns. And when we talk of subjective concerns, that means that all subjective variables of human life would be basically the unit of analysis. Now, what would be the subjective variables? For example, as is well known, human beings have emotions, have sentiments, have feelings, have motivations, have values, have preferences. All these subjective considerations will basically impinge on the research, and therefore, this qualitative research will try to analyze all of them or some of them or sometimes even one of them. Now, while doing this, it has to use certain methodology of research in social science. Now, how to do it? Now, this has been an issue of great debate for quite some time. Now, there have been many revolutions in terms of research methodology. I mean, the most famous revolution in 50s, 40s was the behavioral one, that how to study the behavior of human beings. Similarly, I mean, other techniques have also been devised. Now, but the qualitative research essentially uses, among other techniques, the two most important techniques for investigation and for research purpose. One is the content analysis and another is the interpretative method of research. Now, in today's talk I will be talking about content analysis, while tomorrow I will take up the issue of interpretative method as a tool of qualitative research. Now, first of all, let us have a look at what this qualitative research in terms of this content analysis means. Now, there is hardly any need to re-emphasize this thing, that over the years this written communication has increased manifold. Analysis of communication content, both written and pictorial, has now become methodologically so important that these tools are required invariably to basically make them amenable to investigation and research. Now, this content analysis is basically intended to extract data from wide range of communications. Now, when we talk of communication, these days is the era of it's an age of communication revolution. There are different types of communications in existence in society. Now, the communication not necessarily takes the form of a word or the written document, but sometimes communication is symbolic, sometimes communication is pictorial, sometimes symbolic, the communication is totally coded, and that has to be understood and decoded. So, all these problems are emerging today because of this communication revolution and so on and so forth. So, this content analysis therefore becomes a very important tool to basically go beneath this expressed meaning of any communication, because there are two types of meanings of every communication. One is the the expressed meaning, or the meaning which is totally apparent and visible. Other meaning which is latent, hidden inside, and how to find out that hidden meaning of a particular communication, and that is perhaps the most challenging job. Therefore, content analysis helps a researcher to basically go behind the appearance and find out the truth, the reality. And this type of technique, which is not simply dealing with the appearance, but also the deeper meaning, which is a latent, lying at the latent structure, is definitely one of the most important characteristic of this content analysis. Now, so far as this content analysis is concerned, now the thing is that the method of social science research that aims at the analysis of the content, both qualitative and quantitative, of number of sources like documents, books, newspapers, magazines, and other forms of written material. Now, it is not simply concerned with one variety of communication or one variety of source. I mean, you have the documents, you have the books, you have newspapers, you have magazines, and you have other written material, or even unwritten material, could be oral, could be pictorial, could be symbolic. So, I mean, that way, I mean, it's in terms of source which it basically addresses, or source which it attempts, is wide ranging, and it varies from both written to unwritten. Now, while coming to its definition, in fact, there have been number of attempts to define this content and this content analysis, but Berelson, his definition of content analysis is in these terms, that content analysis is a research technique for the objective, systematic and quantitative description of the most manifest content of the communication. Most manifest content of the communication. Now, the manifest content of the communication is basically something with which apparently this technique is concerned with. But while doing this content analysis, sometimes not only manifest, but even the latent content is also unearthed. The latent content is also basically taken into consideration and account. So, therefore, what we are trying to present here, that content analysis in today's world, particularly when things are not as clear as they appear to be, when particularly the communications are becoming more coded, even the newspaper writings. For example, if one surveys the newspapers and if one tries to do a content analysis of the newspaper, then it becomes very difficult. For example, the recent the flood and devastation in Uttarakhand. For example, if someone tries to do a content analysis of this phenomena in the newspapers, what one will have to do? It will try to do by doing some sampling of data, will perhaps try to do categorization and using number of techniques, but at the same time, while looking at the content, there will be two types of contents. One will be the manifest, another will be latent. The manifest will be perhaps visible on through the eyes, but then the latent meaning will have to be unearthed by making it more broad based, by invoking certain other corollary techniques of qualitative research, and then try to correlate and basically generalize and arrive at a conclusion that how particular issue has been looked at by the media today in terms of its reporting and other things. So, I mean, this is one example. One can go on, but giving number of examples of the same genre. Now, next, what we find that as a qualitative technique, this content analysis is directed towards more subjective information. For example, information regarding attitude, regarding motives, regarding values, but at the same time, when it comes to the quantitative aspect of the research, then entire focus shifts, and it is basically not on those subjective considerations like motives, like values, like predispositions, like sentiments, like attitudes, but it will be something else. For example, it will be perhaps more concerned with the frequency or duration of an event, that how and how many times a particular event has been showing a frequency in particular communication. Now, in terms of looking at the frequency or the duration, one will try to find out a pattern and thereby try to make some generalization, that what this pattern says. For example, if someone picks up a text, both classical or the contemporary, for example, someone picks up a text like Mahabharata and then try to find out if tries to do a content analysis, then one will like to see the frequency of frequency of the occurrence of the term peace in that text, and one would like to see that how many times this peace has occurred and how many times the war has occurred, and thereby will try to look at the frequency and the duration, and then try to make some generalization, that is there any pattern in this communication or not, is there any pattern in this occurrence or not, and on basis of that pattern can any inference be drawn or not. That will be perhaps the purpose of this type of content analysis done in quantitative mode on a text. So, the same text, same unit of analysis, the same data can be subjected to both quantitative as well as qualitative research in terms of this content analysis, but when it is subjected to quantitative research, the content analysis and the techniques will change. While making a content analysis in terms of qualitative research, again the techniques will get transformed, and it will invoke certain other additional tools from the qualitative research to make a more dependable, more authoritative and more uniform and generalized research finding. So, I mean, this is one another aspect. Now, this manifest and latent thing, now what happens that this manifested documents and implied meanings, manifested documents and implied meanings, as I have already explained, that these meanings are already present in the text. It is not something that you are creating, or it is being interpolated, or it is being brought from the outside. Those meanings are already present. The only thing is that how to arrive at those meaning. That is perhaps the biggest challenge. And now arriving at those meaning is basically the task of the research, and therefore the research technique is known for its capability in helping the researcher in accomplishing a particular task or job. And here in this case, because the researcher is trying to basically unearth the latent meaning, not only the apparent or the visible meaning, manifest meaning, therefore this task is a little bit more difficult, and therefore this content analysis sometimes comes handy for researcher. Now, in terms of the content analysis in qualitative research, one can take or for example quantitative, one can take different examples. For example, this technique can be used in context of a study of TV serials. I mean, these days television is becoming very important mode of communication, and number of serials dealing with the social issues, social aspects of human life are normally made and telecast. Now, while doing this content analysis, one would like to see the the content of these serials and what are their implications for the larger social cause. Therefore, I mean this can be one important unit for analysis. Another could be a study of the children's comic book. In United States of America and other places, I mean lot of researches have been done on these comic books, because children is part of the pedagogy. I mean, number of mediums are used to instill values, impart education and knowledge to young children, and comic books is also one such medium. Now, if some researcher wants to do a content analysis of the comic book, it will simply focus that how these comic books are structured, how sometimes the pictorial communications, not only written and the unwritten oral, but even the pictorial communication, because comic books are full of pictorial communications. So, it will be concerned, a researcher will be concerned that how these comic books through pictorial representation of reality is trying to hammer a point or make a point, and therefore this what is the content of it, which is hiding behind this pictorial representation. So, that would be perhaps the task of a content analysis. Now, for example, as I have already mentioned, the newspapers, I mean newspapers reporting on number of issues from contemporary to not so contemporary. For example, an issue like for example violence in Indian society, violence emerging from different sources, violence due to ethnic problem, violence due to this the caste problem, violence during riots, violence due to the this Naxalite problems in different parts of country. Now, if newspapers are reporting invariably about it, then one would like to see that what is basically the purpose of this reporting, what newspapers are ultimately trying to communicate, and that communication has to be understood only in terms of content. Now, as we have already discussed, the content, one content will be visible, but another content will be latent, will be hidden. Now, how to arrive at that content, which is that this communication is trying to basically communicate. Now, that way this method will come handy. Now, for example, I have already mentioned that even not in terms of communication, but even events, some events can be studied and then try to do the content analysis. For example, certain communal rights or the caste violence. I mean, if it is happening and there are researches, and those researches, reportings and different type of documents available on that, both government documents and documents originating from non-governmental sources, those documents have also to be those documents can also be studied and researched using this content analysis. Now, the next aspect of this the next stage in this content analysis would be the characteristics, that on basis of what we have discussed, that what content analysis is all about, what are the characteristics of it, how one can identify or how one can basically understand this content analysis. One way, I mean, one thing which is very important for understanding a content for any theme is to approach it through its characteristics, the features, and it applies to this content analysis as well. Now, when we come to these characteristics of this content analysis, the first important characteristic is objectivity, that content analysis has to be more and more objective, and it should try to remove the biases of researcher, the prejudices, the subjective considerations from analysis as much as it is possible. For example, while doing this analysis, the researchers has to abide by certain rules of the game, and the first important rule is that he has to explicitly or she has to explicitly formulate rules which will be followed in the research. Now, what will happen that if certain rules are formulated and if the researcher sticks to those rules, then what will happen, it will enable two or more persons to obtain the same results from the same documents. For example, if certain rules are formulated and according to those rules, if this analysis is done, then it instills or it basically infuses some objectivity in the the research, because what happens that then it doesn't mean that a person who was doing it, it was simply confined to him. Now it can be tried and it can be operationalized or it can be used by certain other set of people following the same rules, and perhaps they may obtain the same results which was obtained earlier by the other researcher. So, because rules make it more objective, the formulation rules and sorry, formulation of rules and adherence of rules will make it more objective. Now, the second characteristic is systematic, that it has to be systematic. It has to be objective, but at the same time it has to be systematic as well. Now, what does it imply? Systematic means that any research which is using this technique has to include and exclude the content or categories according to consistently applied criteria of selection. Now, what happens that when you are selecting certain certain data for content analysis, then what you have to do, that you have to include or exclude certain categories from your research sample. But while doing this inclusion and exclusion, it should be done arbitrarily, but rather it should be done based on certain criteria, and those criteria should be as clearly stated as possible, because then it will be known that what are the criteria for selection of certain category of data and for excluding certain category of data. If that is done, then what happens that this entire process of exclusion and inclusion of data becomes much more systematic than if it is done haphazardly or arbitrarily. So, objectivity and the systematic thing are very important characteristics of content analysis for making it more scientific and objective, or making it more in fact useful. The third thing is generality. The generality is that this content analysis in terms of its relevance should have more general implication, more general utility. It should not be confined to some time or some space or to some individuals, that those findings are not relevant across the board. I mean, that should not be the case. So, generality, that how it can move from particular to general. I mean, the research done at a particular level, but but because of the techniques used in an objective and systematic manner would make it more general in terms of its implication, in terms of its application, and in terms of its utility. So, I mean, generality is another characteristic of content analysis. Now, the next is quantification. Now, this quantification, now the thing is that mostly done in the quantitative research, but sometimes even in qualitative research this stage is followed, because then perhaps this qualitative inferences are drawn. Now, this quantification is that the answer of the questions which are raised in the research, basically those answers should be in quantitative terms, basically in terms of quantitative or numerals, so that basically it is easier to tabulate or easier to arrange the the conclusions or to draw inferences from those conclusions. So, basically this quantification is part of that. And then finally, the tabulation of frequencies. Now, this is mostly done in quantitative research, less in the qualitative, that tabulation of frequencies, that if the frequency of a event or the frequency of a particular phenomena is being looked for, then these tabulation will be done in terms of the frequencies, that what is the frequency of such phenomena or such event. Now, what happens that sometimes, particularly in terms of doing research of certain market agencies, particularly certain business concerns, what happened that there is also code tables are prepared on basis of this tabulation of frequencies. I mean, through tabular form it is presented that how these frequencies are to be seen, and they are arranged in such a manner in terms of tabular representation using the statistical tool to make it more communicable or make it more intelligible by anyone who will like to see this research finding. So, I mean, these are the characteristics of this content analysis. Next is the process of content analysis. After having looked at the characteristics, that how this content analysis should be used, and what are the properties, essential properties of this tool of social research. Now, there is a process also of doing this content analysis, and the process means the first important process is to specify the problem, because most of the researches suffer on this count, because what happened that the problem is not specified, and therefore, the researcher keeps struggling throughout the the course of his research about the nature of the problem with which he or she is dealing. So, specifying the problem in any research is very important, and so is the case with the content analysis, that identifying the specific research questions. First of all, the first important task of any research design is to specify research questions. Unless you specify them clearly, in fact, you will not be able to handle those questions and those problems in your research. Now, this specification of a problem implies that this specification has to be done theoretically in qualitative social research. Now, using content analysis in qualitative research will imply specifying a problem theoretically, that how theoretically you locate this problem. Now, that means that the researcher should have some awareness about the theoretical issues involved in it, then only he can specify it, then only he will try to look for those problems, not necessarily to validate those arguments, but sometimes just to contest them. But nonetheless, this awareness about the theoretical issues involved in it and then specifying it theoretically would important stage in this entire content analysis in qualitative mode. Now, this helps the researchers in locating the sources also, because you specify the problem and you specify theoretically, then what happens that in handling your research material, in fact, using this technique, it becomes easier for a researcher to locate the source materials like books and other things, that what type of books, documents or the data will be useful for your research. So, a specification would lead to convenience of the researchers in terms of locating the sources. Now, for example, if someone is dealing with the Naxal movement in different parts of India, what he will try to do, first of all, specify it, that what is this problem, how he looks at it, then theoretically you like to identify it, that how it is whether it is related to law and order, whether it is related to development, whether it is related to underdevelopment, or whether it is related to some other thing. So, specifying it, then specifying it theoretically, and then accordingly perhaps he will try to locate the sources for his research. The second process in this content analysis is sampling. Now, the sampling of communication products. Now, what happened that when content analysis is undertaken, then what happens that you will have different varieties of communication products at your disposal. Now, as I mentioned that today's research is much more challenging than it used to be earlier. On the one hand, it is becoming now much more convenient because of number of new modes of communication which make you available the sources at lesser amount of effort, but at the same time because of the multi-faceted nature of communications, it is also becoming difficult. For example, even if you research on any theme, you will find that different types of sources are available. Now, it is also not possible to basically tap all sources. Therefore, what becomes important is the sampling, that you have to do a sampling of the communications and its products. Now, if you do the sampling, then it becomes easier to identify that these are the samples of this particular brand of communication, and these samples will be unit of analysis for your research. Now, next stage in this will be choosing the unit of analysis. Now, this is very important. Now, what is the unit of analysis? Because you are looking for a content of a text, or you are looking for a content of a communication, you are looking for the content of a document. So, what will be the unit of analysis? The unit can be a single word, the unit can be an entire theme of the subject, unit can be one character, unit can be the sentence or a paragraph in a body of literature, or the unit can be one item, the context unit can also be there. So, I think that the unit cannot be uniformly prescribed, that depends on the researcher, that how the unit is selected and chosen, and that will make a lot of difference in terms of the nature of your research and basically the way you will be handling your data. For example, if a single word as a unit is selected for doing a content analysis of a text, as I just mentioned that in Mahabharata, if someone looks for the word peace as a unit in that text and tries to find out that what is the discourse of peace, and then if one does the content analysis of Mahabharata looking for this peace discourse, that whether Mahabharata is essentially a text of peace or it is essentially a text of war, then I think this word as a unit, that is the peace here, would become very important. And if it is done in purely quantitative mode, one would like to see the frequency and the pattern of the uses of the term peace. But if it is not simply and purely in the quantitative terms, even then the frequency will be important, but nonetheless in qualitative terms the larger meanings will be sought from this use of the word peace. For example, what is the pattern, how it is related to certain other concepts and categories. Now, this is also important, that which I am coming to next, the category construction, that in such situation the researcher will have to look for certain categories of concepts, and those concepts which are there, in what context those concepts have been used. So, basically doing this kind of correlation between these concepts, these categories and this particular unit of word will basically help the researcher to unearth the larger and deeper meaning of a particular text or document. So, what happened, this unit of analysis is important, and as I mentioned, the unit can be single word, the unit can be a theme of the subject, unit can be character, and then it can also be a paragraph, and so on and so forth. The next process is the category construction. Now, category construction is another important dimension of this research technique. that like choosing the unit of analysis, we have the category construction, a very important stage in this research. Now, for category construction, what one has to do is to classify the content of the material being investigated. You have to classify that what types of material you are investigating and what is the classification. And after doing this classification, the constructed categories, you have to construct certain categories. After classifying the content, you construct certain categories, and those categories should also reflect the major theoretical concepts on which a study is based. So, there are 2-3 things involved in this category construction. First of all, classifying the material, and after classification, what happened, those materials which are being investigated, that has to be classified, and after classification, what happens, that certain categories have to be constructed, and the categories should be as such that they should reflect the major theoretical concepts on which the theory, the entire study is based. For example, again I will repeat the example of the violence in today's context. Now, the violence, the materials which are used to study violence will have to be first of all classified, and after classification, one will see that what type of categories, particularly in terms of the theoretical concepts which are used to study this violence, whether it is a structural violence or it is the violence in terms of relative deprivation, or if it is violence in terms of other theoretical concerns. In fact, these theoretical concepts which are being used in this study, this classification should be done, and then categories for this research should be constructed keeping in mind these theoretical concepts which are in play in a particular research. For example, this can be applied in case of caste violence, it can be applied in case of studying power relationship in society. In fact, it can be applied in the study of the personality traits of the leaders. It can be done in several other contexts, but the thing is that this category construction in terms of the theoretical concepts and in terms of the classification of material is very important. Now, after these, in fact, the process of content analysis which we have just discussed in terms of specifying the problem, sampling, choosing the unit of analysis and category construction, the next thing I would like to share, which I have already hinted earlier, the sources of the data for the content analysis. And as I mentioned that in today's world, the sources which can be used for this content analysis can vary from written to unwritten, from pictorial to symbolic, from different types of communications, technologically driven, manually done, and so on and so forth. For example, newspapers, books and magazines, documents, films, official records, all of them can be the source for the content analysis. Now, before going ahead, in fact, one thing is very important, that what is know the distinction between the historical method and the content analysis, because normally it is applied on historical text, but then the approach is different, because historical method is basically method in which it is critically examined and analyzed basically the records and survivals of the past. What historical method is all about is basically dealing with the past records and past events. Now, it is nothing contemporary, it is nothing which is basically available in present time. So, what happens that you are using a technique through which you are trying to understand the past, and this is also not very easy job for a researcher. Those who are using historical method, for them it is very difficult to deal with something which is in distant past. which is basically separated by 1000 years or 2000 years, and you are trying to make sense of it, you are trying to interpret it. So, historical method itself is a challenging job, but then there is a difference between historical method and the content analysis. You are also trying to look for the content on a historical text, on a historical event, but nonetheless your technique will be different, because historical method invariably relies on interpretative tool, the interpretative capability or interpretation of the researcher, of a historian or a researcher, investigator who is trying to interpret a particular material, a particular source or particular text which is basically located in past, but you are trying to put your interpretation using number of techniques. Now, that interpretation at times becomes subjective, but while the historical method you have the large amount of subjectivity in this method, but in content analysis the attempt is to reduce the subjectivity, the attempt is to reduce this values and the preferences of researcher as much as possible and make it more objective and more generalizable. Now, recently of course there have been attempts to even make the history as more objective, historical method as more objective and more quantifiable, or one can say that more universal in terms of application, and cutting on these preferences and the biases and the values of the researcher, but nonetheless it carries a lot of subjective factor, whereas in content analysis the attempt is to make it as objective as possible, and therefore these stages are followed. Now, there is another difference, that historical writing always involves a recreation of the past. In fact, what happened that through historical method, what you are doing, that you are not creating the present, but you are creating the past.
Sorry to interrupt you, we have a call from Delhi.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, please ask your question.
Hello.
जी सवाल पूछिए.
जी. Right now I am working on religion, culture and power in the context of everyday politics.
Okay.
And I am trying to understand that how I can use content analysis to understand this whole process.
Religion, culture
and power in the context of everyday politics.
Everyday politics.
Yes.
Now, as you must have heard, in course of our lecture, we have already highlighted that there are certain things which are required for doing this content analysis. One thing is that first of all, you should be clear about the unit of your analysis. Unless you specify your problem, of course, you have specified your problem that you are doing, religion, culture and power. But then the unit of analysis has to be clearly stated in this research agenda, research design. For example, if you are dealing with relations between culture, religion, culture and power in terms of a particular area in Delhi or some other part, then the entire technique will be different, the source material will be different, the nature of handling those sources and data will be different. But if you are looking for this particular phenomena in terms of its representation in the newspapers of last 5 years or 10 years, or in certain types of documents, government documents, or if you are looking for in some scholarly researches in history, culture, religion and power, how it is reflected in historical research, or in the research in sociology and political science. So, I mean, first of all, you have to specify clearly along with the problem the unit of your analysis. Unless you specify it, this content analysis would not be possible to do. Now, after specifying this unit, the next step would be to basically classify the data available, and then accordingly you will have to invoke certain theoretical categories if you are doing a qualitative research. I mentioned earlier that this technique can be used both in qualitative and quantitative. So, you should be clear that what type of research you are trying to basically do. If you are doing qualitative research, then two things are important: classification of your categories, and those categories should reflect the theoretical concerns which are going to reflect in your study, because that implies that you have to, you should have some familiarity or awareness with the theoretical concerns with this problem, that is caste, religion, culture and power. So, I mean, this way you can make use of this content analysis. Yes. So, I was dealing with the difference between historical method and the content analysis, and what I have discovered that this historical method, apart from being dealing with the past, is also something related to the recreation of the past in the present.
We have another caller.
Yeah.
Call from Kolkata. Yeah, good afternoon. Please ask your question.
Hello.
Yeah, please ask
I'm
your
from
question.
Kolkata. I want to know that research of Calcutta in other side of in many countries. Why?
Okay. Please continue your question.
Hello.
Yeah. Ask your question.
Please answer me.
Can you be louder?
Yes.
Ask your question, please.
Yes. I want to know that I research in many countries in outside of India.
Okay. Go ahead. I'm getting
Hello?
you. Go ahead.
I think some problem. Disconnect. Continue.
Yeah, I think we have lost
Yeah.
connection.
Okay.
So basically, this historical, in fact, writing as not.
We have another call from.
Yeah.
Call from. Okay, from JNU Delhi. Yeah. Good afternoon. Please ask your question.
Should I ask? Okay. I am Ruchi, doing my PhD on politics of water as natural resource.
Okay.
My question is, how can I decipher the ideology of the World Bank through the literature they have produced on water?
It's a good question.
Okay. Ideology
The
of World
question is
Bank.
that how can I find out the ideology of World Bank through the literature they have basically produced? Yeah, in fact, Ruchi, in terms of what we have discussed, about this content analysis, what you'll have to do, first of all, you'll have to sample, the entire, documents coming from the World Bank, and creating a sample in the sense that they produce different types of documents, but we'll be primarily concerned with those documents which are dealing with these natural resources. And then you'll have to identify certain certain categories which are basically emerging in those documents, and those categories, how they are reflective of their larger ideological framework, the moorings of the ideological moorings of the World Bank.
Okay.
So I mean, this will be more of a qualitative, the research in the qualitative genre using this content analysis. Okay. So I mean, the unit you'll have to select in terms of the natural resources as the way they are declaring natural resources as part of the market, the way they are trying to dissociating the community ownership from the natural resources. All these things
we'll discuss
will
in
be
detail,
the
but
unit of analysis.
Before that, we take up question from Gujarat. Yeah, good afternoon. Please ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
सोशल साइंस और रिसर्च मेथोडोलॉजी के लिए मैं ऐसा मानता हूँ कि सोशल समाज पर इफेक्ट होता है कई और इकोनॉमिक क्षेत्र का और पॉलिटिकल क्षेत्र का भी समाज पे इफेक्ट होता है, और भी जो कई फैक्टर्स है करप्शन उसका भी समाज पर इफेक्ट होता है। तो जब समाज को ठीक करना है तो किस प्रकार का रिसर्च किया जाए जिसे आप समाज को बेनिफिट कर सकते हैं। गुजरात साकंबा से परेश पंचाल।
इनफैक्ट समाज को ठीक करने के लिए क्या क्या इकोलॉजिकल और कई सारे डायमेंशन हैं जिसको इन्होंने ऐड किया, तो फर्स्ट तो आइडेंटिफाई करना होगा कि कौन सी डायमेंशन को लेकर रिसर्च करना चाहते हैं।
इनका जो प्रश्न है वो सामाजिक संदर्भ में काफ़ी महत्वपूर्ण है, लेकिन इसमें दो तीन चीज़ें आपको देखना होगा। कोई भी रिसर्च चाहे वो कंटेंट एनालिसिस के थ्रू कर रहे हो, कोई भी कर रहे हो, उसमें तो पहली बात जो समस्या क्या है आपके सामने, वो जब तक स्पष्ट रूप से नहीं रहेगा तब तक आप अपने शोध में आगे नहीं बढ़ पाएंगे। तो समस्या का निर्धारण सबसे महत्वपूर्ण पहलू है। तो पहले आप समस्या को निर्धारित करें और उस निर्धारित समस्या को देखने का कौन सा तरीका आप अपनाना चाह रहे हैं, ये भी आप ही को तय करना होगा।
सही बात।
ये दोनों चीज यदि आप तय कर लें तब फिर प्रश्न उठता है जो कौन सा जो तौर तरीका है, जो टेक्निक है, जो मेथड है शोध का, वो आपके लिए उपयोगी होगा।
तो समाज सुधार के
तो समाज सुधार ऐसा पहलू है जिसमें कि मूल्यात्मक जो शोध है, जो क्वालिटेटिव रिसर्च जो कहते हैं, वही ज़्यादा उपयुक्त होता है, क्योंकि उसमें कई तरह की चीज़ें हैं जो कि मूल्य से जुड़ा हुआ है। क्या अच्छा है, क्या बुरा है, इस तरह की जो संभावना है उसको आप खोजेंगे। तो इन चीज़ों के लिए आपके लिए मूल्यात्मक जो शोध है वो उपयुक्त होगा।
ओके, दिल्ली से कॉलर हैं, उनका सवाल लेते हैं। जी नमस्कार, सवाल पूछिए।
What are the conditions on which we will make a decision that we should prioritize content analysis over other forms of method? For instance, suppose we want to use empirical survey or ethnographic research or case study method. In what kind of situation we need to take this content analysis compared to those other methods?
In fact, this is another important question. In fact, this content analysis, one utility of the content analysis is normally seen in terms of the requirement of resources, because for doing any other type of research which you have just now mentioned, whether it's ethnographic study or any other study, would involve huge research project in terms of resources, in terms of manpower, in terms of the time span, and so on and so forth. But for doing this content analysis, because you are basically specifying your problem and you are also basically selecting the unit of your analysis in terms of the data, and therefore once you do the two things, then it becomes quite economical in terms of the research budget and other things. So that is perhaps one consideration. And secondly, the time span also, because for in a limited time span one can arrive at certain very definitive conclusions, or certain conclusions which can have larger implications by using a particular set of data, and then try to use the same conclusions, same findings on certain other set of data, and then find this correlation, that how the two can be used for the larger generalization or theoretical postulation. So I think that way content analysis is very useful, but it is in no way a substitute for other techniques which you have already mentioned. All of them have their own utility and of value in their respective context. So I think that one has to take into account certain other factors for choosing this content analysis. If other factors which I have already excluded, if they are present, then of course one can have the choices either to go for this content analysis or for ethnographic study, because there are certain things which you can find only
से एक दर्शक हैं, उनका सवाल लेते हैं। जी नमस्कार, सवाल पूछिए।
हेलो
जी, सवाल पूछिए।
हाँ नमस्कार। नमस्कार
जी।
ये सर मैं एमफिल के लिए जो है कितनी परसेंटेज होनी चाहिए एमफिल सोशियोलॉजिकल की?
आपकी आवाज़ साफ नहीं आ रही है,
तो साफ बताएं।
ओके, और एमफिल करना चाहते हैं तो उसमें कितना परसेंटेज मार्क्स आना चाहिए ताकि वो एमफिल कर सके? का प्रश्न है, रिलेट इससे संबंधित नहीं है,
शोध से संबंधित नहीं है ये। तो आप किसी विश्वविद्यालय जहाँ पे आप करना चाह रहे हैं वहाँ से संपर्क साधें तो शायद आपको कुछ उसका समस्या का समाधान मिलेगा। क्योंकि यदि आप एमफिल शोध में यदि आपको कोई समस्या है शोध से संबंधित, जिसमें कि रिसर्च मेथड का कोई संबंध हो, तो आप प्रश्न करें, मैं उसके बारे में कुछ बता सकता हूँ।
ऐसे 55% मार्क्स,
वैसे 55% का रिक्वायरमेंट जैसे कि अमरेश जी बोल रहे हैं सबको पता है जो होता है, तो वो चीज़ है। लेकिन सही होगा आप किसी विश्वविद्यालय,
हर विश्वविद्यालय का अलग अलग अपना मापदंड
है, और उसके ऑफिस से पता करें।
कंटिन्यू करें। हिस्टोरिकल में
so historical I was trying to make a distinction between historical and the content analysis, because in historical method, as I was mentioning, that not only in terms of the distance, in terms of the time and space, but also in terms of the entire nature of the enterprise, because what you try to do in historical method, historical research, that you try to recreate the past, and sometimes that recreation is always in the image of the present. So I mean that's why, in the political philosophy, a lot of people who talk about historical or social scientific research, and particularly in history, they talk of double hermeneutics, saying that there are two types of interpretation. The first interpretation, that the sources which you are using for your research are already interpretative source, because they might have interpreted certain events of that period, and then you are also putting your interpretation on that. So it is a double hermeneutics. So I mean, that kind of possibility is in historical research, and that perhaps cuts its objectivity in terms of infusing large amount of subjective considerations and preferences and values. Whereas in content analysis, as I mentioned, the focus is always on objectivity, because as much as possible you keep out the subjective considerations out from your research. But nonetheless, if it is a qualitative research, I think we will be simply befooling ourselves if we feel that no subjective consideration will impinge on the research. That will be there, but then try to rationalize it as much as possible. So I think that is one difference between the historical method and the content analysis. But even in historical research, what happened, that when we do the interpretation, we try to look at certain corollary evidences and then try to fit into our own imagination, the imagination of historians. So I mean, that nonetheless is a recreation of the past. But in content analysis, you are not recreating, but you are trying to find out, decode certain cryptic meanings, cryptic codes which are there, and thereby you are trying to move from the appearance to the reality. And therefore, the most important job of science, as it is stated, that is to move from appearance to reality. So that way content analysis also tries to do it the same way, but dealing with the human world, the human society, and therefore this task is highly laudable. Now the next is that, again with the historical methods, in fact the central sources of data for historian are mostly the written records. Now there are primary sources which are done or collected through field work, through ethnographic studies, and etc. For example, where the eyewitnesses become their events, and also that is supplemented with the secondary sources like written materials, etc. and etc. But on the other hand, when we come to content analysis, it is totally contextualist. A researcher tries to relate the phenomena he is studying to certain aspects of life. Basically, it is only in terms of context of that particular phenomena. So whereas it is contextual, the historical research becomes more general. So I mean, this is another important. Then the micro and macro level. The content analysis can be both macro and the macro and the micro. For example, you can choose a small unit, or you can choose a larger unit. But nonetheless, the historical research also has this micro considerations, but nonetheless, when it comes to generalization, normally they make a macro generalization, not the micro generalization. Now, different types of content analysis.
We have another question from Uttar Pradesh. Yeah, good afternoon. Please ask your question.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Yeah, firstly, I want to thank to Mr. Jha sir for such important information.
Okay.
And my first question is, how many stages in research methodology, and what is the role of bibliography in the research methodology?
Stages in the research method.
Research method.
Yeah.
Now,
And the role of ethnography, I think.
ethnography or bibliography?
Bibliography.
Bibliography.
Yeah.
Anyway, I will tell you about both. Yeah. Now the stages, it depends that what type of tool you are choosing for your research, but nonetheless there are stages which are common for all types of researches. For example, if you had heard yesterday's lecture on that introductory part about the research design, I think these things would have come up there, but nonetheless I will repeat you that the first important stage is in any research design is to basically identify the problem. That you have to identify the problem on which you are going to research. Once you identify the problem, then you have to, the second stage will be that what are the issues involved in that problem, what you are looking for, because it is not possible for researcher to look for each and every issue related with the problem. So you have to basically identify the problem, then its related question would be to basically specify the problem in some context, then selection of method will be the following. will be following it, because what type of method you are selecting for your study. Then the sources you have to see, whether you are going to handle primary sources or secondary sources. And then you are mentioning bibliography. If you are asking for bibliography, then bibliography is very important. After finishing your research, I mean, that will be important component of your research report or your thesis, whatever. But if you are talking about research during the time of the research, then of course you have the requirement of having certain sources which you will be looking for.
Sorry to interrupt, we are having less time, so we can't continue. Tomorrow we'll discuss
tomorrow
in detail.
Remaining, and then we'll take.
So friends, we conclude today's lecture, and I thank all of you for watching the lecture. On behalf, I thank Dr. Satish Jha for giving such a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.